The first time I found a security alert on my phone showing that someone had tried to reset my online banking credentials from a device I'd never seen before. I was standing at my father's kitchen counter in Raleigh, with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. I read the notification carefully. Then I put my phone face down on the counter, poured the coffee into the sink, and started a fresh cup. My stepmother, Valerie Sutton, walked in from the garage a few minutes later, tossed her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, and asked if I wanted breakfast. I told her coffee was fine. She started pulling things out of the refrigerator, and I watched her, and I thought, not yet. Because here's what Delphine did not fully understand about me. I am a cardiac surgeon. I have been a cardiac surgeon for 11 years, and before that I spent 13 years in classrooms and labs and operating rooms that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, learning how to make decisions that determine whether a human heart keeps beating. That kind of training doesn't stay inside the hospital. It follows you home. It sits with you at your father's kitchen counter at 8 o'clock in the morning and tells you the same thing it tells you before a difficult procedure. Don't react to the first signal. Gather everything. Understand the complete picture before you move. I had driven up from Durham the evening before, a Thursday in early December, 2 weeks cleared after a run of back-to-back call shifts that had left me tired in the specific way that too many consecutive nights in an operating room will do. I don't have children. I've never been married. I have a condo I love, a department that needs me, and a set of financial accounts I built payment by payment starting at 30 years old, when I finally had a salary that exceeded my loan obligations. Those accounts are the one thing in my life that no one helped me create. Not a single dollar came from a family cushion, or an inheritance, or someone spotting me when things got tight. Every cent is the accumulated weight of a choice I made at 19 to become a surgeon, and everything that choice required of me across the 2 decades that followed. My mother, Ann Sutton, died 9 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to the end, which is the particular cruelty of that disease. It doesn't give you time to prepare, only time to watch. I was 32 and 2 years into my attending position at Duke Medical Center, and I remember standing at the graveside in January thinking that all those years of missing holidays and calling her from hospital corridors at midnight, all of it was partly to reach a place she could be proud of, and she had seen it, barely, before she was gone. My father, Charles Sutton, remarried 2 years later. I didn't begrudge him that. He was 63, retired from 30 years of teaching high school history, and grief at that age carries a particular loneliness that younger people don't always recognize. Delphine was someone he'd met through a mutual friend, organized, decisive, with strong opinions about how a household should run and a way of filling a room that had probably felt like relief to a man who'd been living alone in a house full of my mother's things. I told myself she was good for him. He seemed more settled with her there. What I didn't pay close enough attention to, across those 7 years, was the pattern of questions. The first Christmas after they married, Delphine asked me what a cardiac surgeon at Duke earns. I laughed and called it a personal question, and she laughed too, and we moved on. The second year, she mentioned an article she'd read about physician compensation, and asked whether I was doing anything smart with the excess. By the 4th year, I had stopped cataloging the individual questions because answering any single one felt like less effort than naming what they collectively were. She knew about my 401k. She knew roughly what I contributed to my brokerage account each month. She once asked, in passing, who I'd named as beneficiary on my life insurance, and I told her it was handled and changed the subject, and I never thought about it again until much later when I should have been thinking about it constantly. That December morning, after Delphine went upstairs, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my banking app and scrolled back through the security activity log. There wasn't one alert. There were 5, spread across the previous 8 weeks, all from the same unrecognized device, all at hours when I would have been either asleep or scrubbed in on a case. Each attempt had reached the 2-factor verification step and stopped there. Each one had provided correct answers to my security questions: my mother's maiden name, the address of this house on Whitmore Lane, the name of the golden retriever I had when I was 10 years old, a dog named Biscuit. I had told that story at a dinner table that Delphine sat at every night for 7 years. I put the phone in my pocket. I thought about the feeling I get in the OR right before something I didn't anticipate reveals itself on the table. Not panic, not yet, something colder and more focused than panic. Then I went upstairs and made the guest bed with the precision I bring to everything, when I need my hands to be doing something my brain doesn't have to supervise. Then I came back down and asked my father if he wanted to walk to the coffee shop. He did. We went. We talked about nothing important, and while we were gone, I started making a mental list of everything I was going to do when I got back. My father had mentioned, some months earlier, that he still had a folder of old paperwork of mine in the filing cabinet in the office. Tax documents and financial forms that had been mailed to this address before I'd gotten around to updating everything after residency. I asked him about it that afternoon casually, while Delphine was out at what she called her Thursday standing lunch. He said it was in the bottom drawer, he hadn't touched it in years. I found the folder exactly where he said it would be, but what was inside was not what I had left there. There were printed copies of bank statements from an account I'd closed 8 years ago. Statements I had never printed, never mailed, never given to anyone. There was a handwritten note in Delphine's handwriting. I knew her handwriting from 7 years of birthday cards and grocery lists left on the counter, with account numbers and routing information and my mother's maiden name written in a column. The way someone writes something down when they're trying to memorize a sequence. There was a beneficiary update form from my life insurance provider, undated, filled in with information that matched my current policy, with a secondary beneficiary line that had been scratched out so thoroughly the ink had worn through the paper. I stood in that office with the folder in my hands and I felt something clarify inside me. The same clarification I feel when a scan comes back and confirms what the clinical picture was already telling me. I wasn't surprised. That was the part I kept returning to as I stood there. I wasn't surprised, which meant some part of me had already known and had been choosing, for reasons I'd have to examine later, not to look directly at it. I photographed every page. I replaced the folder exactly as I'd found it. Then I went to the guest room, opened my laptop, and I worked through the afternoon the same way I work a difficult case, methodically, without rushing the steps. I changed every banking password and every email address associated with each account. I updated my security questions to answers that would be meaningless to anyone except me, nothing tied to my childhood, my family, my history that had been told at a dinner table. I added an authentication app as a second layer on top of the text verification I already had. Then I called the bank's fraud line and spent 43 minutes on hold, which I used to write out a complete inventory of every financial account I held and every potential vulnerability in each one. The fraud representative confirmed that the activity I'd described matched a pattern their system flagged as deliberate, repeated, unauthorized access attempts. She set a verbal password on my account, a word required before any phone-based changes could be processed, and offered to escalate the record internally. I told her yes to both. I asked for a full login history going back 12 months. While I waited for the email confirmation, I looked at an old photograph sitting on the nightstand in the guest room. My mother and me, maybe a year before she was diagnosed. Both of us at the kitchen counter right downstairs, her in the blue apron she wore every Thanksgiving. Me still in my hospital scrubs because I'd come straight from a shift. She was laughing at something I'd just said. I could not for the life of me remember what it was. 2 days later, I was running along the Greenway path near my father's neighborhood. Cold morning, the kind of quiet December air that feels different from the quiet inside a hospital, cleaner somehow, less freighted, when my phone rang. It was the bank's fraud department. The representative told me, in the practiced careful tone of someone who delivers difficult information as a regular part of their job, that there had been a new incident that morning. A call had come into customer service. The caller had identified herself as me and requested that a secondary account holder be added to my primary checking account. She had correctly answered every standard security question. She had not been able to provide the verbal password added 2 days earlier, and the request had been denied. The call had been recorded. She asked if I wanted it sent to my email. I said yes and stood still on the path until the email arrived. Then I clicked the audio file and listened. The voice was Delphine's. Not a guess, not an impression. Her voice, the one I'd heard across my father's dinner table for 7 years, warm and unhurried, explaining to the representative that her stepdaughter was a physician, with an extremely demanding travel schedule, and that she was simply helping manage things to ensure there was no gap in oversight while Valerie was away. I listened to it twice. Then I put the phone in my jacket pocket and ran the last mile back to the house, at a pace that had nothing to do with fitness, and everything to do with needing somewhere to put what I was feeling before I walked through that door. Delphine was in the living room when I came in, reading something on her laptop. She looked up and I watched a flicker of something move across her face. Not guilt exactly, more the look of someone recalculating a situation they'd believed was under control. I told her I had received a call from my bank's fraud department. She set the laptop aside carefully. She began to say that she'd only been trying to help, that there were scenarios where someone needed access in an emergency, that as a physician I surely understood the value of contingency planning. I told her I was going to wait for my father. When he came in from the garage, I played the recording from my phone so both of them could hear it without any interpretive language from me. I laid out the folder contents on the kitchen table, my photographs of them, printed that morning at the FedEx on Glenwood while my father was at his Saturday errands. I walked them through the timeline of login attempts, the dates, the hours, the device. My father's face went very still about halfway through. Delphine said she hadn't meant any harm by it. I told her that a pattern documented across 8 weeks and multiple methods was not an absence of intention. She said that family shared resources. That was the nature of family. That she had spent 7 years being part of this household and that counted for something. And that was when I asked my father a question I had been sitting with, since I stood in that office with the folder in my hands. Do you know what this money actually is? The kitchen went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when someone asks a question that matters. My father said my name, he didn't say anything else. So I told him. I didn't raise my voice. I have never needed to raise my voice when I have something important to say, because volume is what you reach for when you don't trust the words alone to carry weight. I trust mine. I told him that the balance in my accounts is not a number. It is time. It is the medical school loans I carried for the first 7 years of my attending career. $2,800 a month, every month, while I was also trying to build something stable enough to last. It is the 13 years of training during which I missed more events than I can count, not because I didn't want to be there, but because the work required it and I had chosen the work. It is the patients, the ones we saved and the ones we didn't. I have stood in a hallway outside a cardiac ICU at 2 a.m. and told a man in his 40s that his wife's heart had given out despite everything we'd done, that sometimes the damage is beyond what any surgeon can repair, that I was sorry and I meant it completely. Then I went back in and operated on the next patient, because that is the nature of the job I chose and the discipline it requires. And you do not get to look at what that produced and call it a family resource. I paused. I watched my father's face. He was looking at me the way he used to look at me when I was a child, and said something that caught him off guard. Not the daughter he'd been carrying a picture of in his head, but the actual person standing in front of him that the picture had never fully captured. I turned to Delphine and I told her clearly, without any ambiguity, that every account had already been secured, that every document in that folder would be leaving with me, and that the verbal and legal record of what had been attempted was complete. I told her that if there was a single further attempt, at any account in any form through any channel, it would not be handled as a family conversation. It would be handled as the fraud that it was. Delphine's jaw tightened. She said she'd only ever thought of me as family. I told her that thinking of someone as family and treating what they built as available for your use were two different things, and that she had confused them for long enough. My father walked Delphine out of the kitchen. I heard them in the hallway for a while, his voice low, hers starting with arguments and ending in silence. I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the backyard. My mother had planted every spring until she couldn't anymore, and I let myself feel, for a few minutes, the particular exhaustion of understanding something, fully that you had been partially understanding for a long time, without letting yourself finish the thought. That evening my father found me in the guest room. He didn't say much. He asked if he could look at some things on his own, and I said of course. He came back 2 nights later. He'd gone through Delphine's email on the tablet they shared for household accounts, their streaming subscriptions, their grocery delivery, the logistical architecture of a marriage. He hadn't been looking for anything specific, he said. He just needed to see if he'd been missing something obvious. He sat down on the edge of the guest room chair and turned the tablet toward me. There were messages going back 4 years. To her college roommate, to a cousin in Phoenix, and twice to a financial planner she'd apparently consulted on her own without mentioning it to my father. In each thread my name appeared somewhere, always in the context of my earnings, my retirement accounts, my savings. Always with some version of the same logic. That I didn't have children. That I didn't have a spouse. That the money I'd built would eventually need somewhere to go. And that there was no reason that somewhere couldn't be planned for in advance. In one message from 3 years ago, she had written, "She works too hard to spend it and she won't live forever. It makes sense to think ahead." My father read it aloud in a voice that shook slightly at the end. Then he closed the tablet and set it down on the nightstand and stared at his hands. He said he'd thought she loved me. He genuinely believed that. I told him that loving someone and quietly positioning yourself to benefit from what they'd built were not mutually exclusive. That people managed to hold both at once more often than most of us wanted to accept. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he kept thinking about my mother. How she had never once, not even in the years before she got sick when money was genuinely tight. When the roof needed repair and the car needed replacing and they were stretching every paycheck. Had she ever treated what I was building as anything other than entirely mine? He said she used to talk about me the same way she talked about the garden. You plant the seed, you give it what it needs, and then you step back and let it become what it's going to become. You don't harvest what isn't yours to harvest. I felt something tighten in my chest at that. A grief I don't let myself sit with often. Because grief and clinical precision don't coexist easily, and I have spent years training one of them to wait. She would have hated this, I said. Not for the money. For what it says about how easy it can be to let something corrosive into a house and call it family. My father nodded, and he said something I didn't expect. He said, "I should have protected you." And I said quietly that protection was for someone who couldn't protect themselves. What I'd needed from him. Across 7 years of small questions and off-limit dinner table topics, and one very clear conversation that he'd smoothed over before it could land. What I'd needed was for him to ask the questions that would have required him to admit something uncomfortable about the person he was living with. That was what I'd needed, and it was the thing he hadn't given me. He didn't argue with that. The next morning, he knocked on my door before I'd finished packing. He had something in his hands. A small painted recipe box, pale blue with a wooden latch, that had sat on my mother's kitchen counter for as long as I could remember, and had been missing from the kitchen since she died. He said he'd kept it because giving it to me felt like a final acknowledgement that she was gone in a way he hadn't been ready for. He said it was time. I opened it alone that evening. The recipe cards were there, her handwriting in blue ballpoint, the same cards she'd written out for the dishes she made every year at every holiday, her cursive tilting slightly to the right the way it always did. But underneath them was a folded piece of notepaper I hadn't seen before. At the top, in her handwriting, she'd written my name. She said she knew the road I'd chosen would require things she couldn't fully prepare me for. She said she had watched me my whole life understand, without anyone having to tell me, the difference between people who were genuinely in my corner and people who admired what I was becoming without ever asking what it cost. She wrote, "Don't let anyone convince you that your sacrifices belong to them, simply because they've been close enough to watch you make them." I sat with that note for a long time. By the end of the week, everything was restructured, every account, every policy, every legal document. My attorney, Leslie Park, who had set up my estate plan when I was 31, reviewed the full picture and confirmed what I already understood. The documentation constituted a clear pattern of deliberate unauthorized access attempts, and I should retain everything. I did. My father told Delphine the morning I was leaving that they needed to talk. He didn't specify what about. He didn't need to. Delphine and I had said everything we were going to say. She was at the top of the stairs when I carried my bag to the car, and she looked at me and said she hoped I could eventually find a way to understand her position. I looked back up at her and told her that I understood her position completely, which was why nothing about what I'd done would be reversed. My father carried my bag to the car even though I told him I had it. He stood on the driveway in the December cold, and he looked older than he had looked 2 weeks ago, or maybe I was finally letting myself see something I'd been softening for years. He said he should have been clearer about what was mine. He said he let peace in the house become more important than truth in his own family, and he understood now what that had cost me. I told him that was a start, that love and trust were 2 different currencies, and that we'd be spending a while on the exchange rate between them. He said he knew. He hugged me long and held on, and when he pulled back, he wasn't trying to hide that his eyes were wet. I got in the car and drove. On 40, heading back to Durham, in the particular morning quiet of a highway that hasn't filled up yet, I thought about what I say to surgical residents when they're standing at a decision point, and second-guessing themselves past the moment when action is required. I tell them, you gathered the data, you understand what you're looking at, and hesitating now doesn't change what the data says. It only delays the response. I thought about my mother's note. I thought about 7 years of questions I'd deflected, because deflecting was easier than naming what they were adding up to. I thought about the particular cost of choosing the path of least resistance with the people closest to you. How it feels like kindness in the moment and accumulates into something else entirely over time. There are limits I've learned to respect inside an operating room that have nothing to do with skill or intention. They're the limits of what a damaged structure can continue to bear. And the most important thing I've understood in 11 years of this work is that recognizing a limit isn't the same as giving up. It's information. It tells you what has already been sustained, and it tells you what the structure will not survive again if you pretend the damage isn't there. The hardest boundaries I've ever had to establish were not the ones I built against strangers. They were the ones I had to build inside my own family, in the house where I grew up, using the only materials available to me. My own clarity about what I'd built and what it cost, and the willingness to say so out loud to the people I most wanted to be able to trust. Those boundaries aren't posted anywhere. There's no sign, no fence, no legal marker at the property line. You build them yourself, out of everything you know to be true, and then you hold them. That's the only way they hold.